Have you ever noticed, the more you try to forget someone, the more tightly they seem to hold on to your mind? It's strange, isn't it? They're no longer in your life, not in your room, not in your days, and yet they're everywhere, in the silence between two songs, in the way your breath catches when a memory stirs, in the dreams you didn't ask for. Why is that? Today we'll walk gently into this mystery. Through the lens of Buddhist wisdom, we'll explore why some people stay alive in our thoughts, long after they've left our lives. But this isn't about forgetting them. It's about finding freedom. You'll learn a truth the Buddha taught, not just about letting go, but about loving differently, loving without clinging, loving in a way that sets you free too. And somewhere near the end, I'll share a Zen parable about a monk, a memory, and a pebble placed in a bowl. It might just change the way you carry your past. So if something in you is still holding on, join me. Let's walk this path together, softly, one breath at a time. And if you feel called to, subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings, not just to watch, but to walk this journey with us. Chapter 1, The Fire We Thought Was Love. I thought I missed him, but it wasn't him I longed for. It was who I was when he loved me. There was a time in my life when I'd wake up with the echo of someone else's name resting on my lips, like a morning prayer I hadn't meant to say. His face wasn't in front of me anymore, but somehow it still lingered, like the scent of sandalwood incense long after the stick has burned out. It's strange, isn't it? How someone can be absent from your life for years, even decades, and yet remain more present than the people sitting across from you at dinner. I didn't see his face in person, but I saw it in reflections, in the back of my mind, in quiet places, in empty cafes where I imagined him walking in, smiling, as if no time had passed. I used to call that love. But now, years deeper into this practice of presence, of letting go, of listening inward, I'm starting to see it was something else. It was attachment dressed up in love's clothing, like a fire that we mistake for warmth, until it starts to burn us. There's a Zen story I once heard, about a monk who fell in love with a traveler. For weeks they spoke under moonlight, shared meals in silence, and laughed at nothing in particular. When the traveler left, the monk thought of her every day. He couldn't meditate, couldn't eat. Her voice echoed in his chanting. His master, an older monk with eyes like old wood, placed a single pebble in his student's bowl one morning. "This," the elder said, "is how you've been feeding your heart." The monk stared. "A stone?" "No." The elder smiled. "A memory, hard, heavy. You chew on it like it's food. But it was never meant to nourish you forever." That story stayed with me, because I think many of us, maybe even you sitting there with that quiet ache in your chest, have been chewing on stones. We call it love because we felt something powerful, something consuming, and perhaps at some point it was love. But love is not obsession. Love does not twist itself into knots just to fit someone's absence. Love does not leave you checking your phone at midnight, hoping to see their name just once more. True love, in the teachings of the Buddha, brings peace. What we often cling to, however, is not love but attachment. Attachment is what causes the mind to spin stories, to replay conversations, to scroll endlessly through old pictures or imagine new ones that will never be taken. Attachment is the flame that burns when we hold too tightly. I used to lie awake at night, telling myself that if I was still thinking of him, it must be because I loved him that deeply. The world romanticizes that, doesn't it? The one who got away, the endless longing, the beautiful tragedy of remembering. But Zen asks a different question. Not why do I still love him, but rather, what is it in me that cannot let go? And when I finally sat still long enough to hear the answer, it startled me. I wasn't in love with him. I was in love with the version of me that I was when he loved me. I missed being adored. I missed being someone's favorite person. I missed the mirror he held up, showing me a version of myself that felt radiant and full. But I had given him that power, to define me, to validate me, to make me feel whole. So of course, when he left, it wasn't just him I lost. It was that version of me too. And that is the wound that doesn't heal easily. In Buddhist teaching, there's an image often used to describe attachment. The Buddha said it's like holding a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You hold on, but you are the one who gets burned. That was me, holding a hot memory, waiting to blame it on someone else. But pain doesn't come from memories alone. Pain comes from our clinging to them, from our refusal to accept what has already changed. There's a soft rain falling outside as I write this. It reminds me of a morning long ago when I sat on the porch of a small temple in northern Thailand. A novice monk beside me pointed at the lotus blossoms just beginning to open in the garden. "See," he whispered. "They do not bloom by holding on to the night. They open only when they accept the sun." That image never left me, because I realized I had been trying to bloom in the dark, still holding on to someone who had long stopped walking beside me, still hoping to recreate a feeling that only ever lived in a moment that had passed. And I wonder, maybe you're doing the same. Maybe your heart has become a museum, carefully curating the best moments of what once was. But my dear friend, you were never meant to live inside a memory. You were meant to live here, now, fully. And it's okay if letting go feels like a kind of death. It is, but it's also a kind of birth. Because when you release the false idea that love means holding on, you begin to discover the kind of love that doesn't ask you to suffer. The kind of love that exists even when the person is no longer yours. The kind of love that simply wishes them well wherever they are, and wishes you well too. If you're still here with me, breathing softly as you read these words, I want to invite you to ask yourself something. Gently, no judgment. Just an honest question whispered into the quiet. Am I remembering them? Or am I clinging to who I was when they were in my life? Because if it's the latter, then what you're grieving isn't just a person. It's a part of you you're afraid to become again on your own. But you can. You can be that radiant version of yourself without needing their gaze to light you up. You can be your own mirror, your own soft landing place. It just takes time, presence, and the courage to sit with your own heart, even when it trembles. So let that flame flicker. Let it die down, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a soft breath of release. Love, when it is real, never leaves scars. But attachment held too long will scorch the soul. Let's hold the fire more wisely now. Let it warm us, but no longer burn us. Let it be the light that helps us find our way home, to ourselves. And if the night ever gets too quiet, and you find yourself remembering again, don't run from it. Just sit, breathe, smile gently at the memory, and remind your heart, this too is passing. The lotus only blooms when it stops grasping for the sun and simply receives its light. You are that lotus, and the light has been waiting. Chapter 2, the voice that keeps returning. Karma, forgiveness, and the heart's unfinished songs. I used to think I was just dreaming. It started the year after my father and I stopped speaking. We hadn't had a dramatic falling out. No shouting match, no slammed doors. Just the slow unraveling of connection. A long thread that snapped silently. First it was fewer phone calls, then birthdays missed, then nothing. But the dreams came anyway. Night after night, I'd find myself sitting at a kitchen table that looked vaguely like the one from my childhood. The lights were always dim. There was always a cup of tea cooling on the table. And he was always there, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking in that same steady tone I hadn't heard in years. And sometimes he was just looking at me with eyes full of things unsaid. I used to wake up with my chest tight, as though I had been holding my breath all night. I told myself it was just memory, that I had moved on, that I had good reason to stay away. But the dreams kept coming. And at some point, maybe during a quiet morning while journaling, or maybe while listening to the wind brush against the temple bell outside my window, I began to ask myself something I had avoided for years. What if this wasn't just memory? What if this was karma? Not in the way people often use the word as punishment or revenge, but in the older, deeper sense that the Buddha meant. Karma not as retribution, but as incompletion. Like a song that ended too soon, like a breath held too long. Karma, in the teachings I've come to love, is not about getting what you deserve. It's about finishing what hasn't yet been understood, about healing the places that are still carrying pain, about meeting what you've avoided with a different kind of presence. That's what I hadn't done with my father. I hadn't forgiven him, but more than that, I hadn't listened to what my own heart still wanted to say. So it kept speaking, through dreams, through sudden waves of sadness, through old birthday cards I couldn't quite throw away. And I've come to believe that this is what the mind does when the heart hasn't finished its song. It sings it in quiet ways, over and over. A dear friend of mine once told me about the last voicemail she ever got from her mother. She deleted it in a moment of anger, only to regret it for years. Even now, she says, she sometimes hears her mother's voice in dreams, not speaking anything in particular, just a sound that seems to rise from the chest, not the mind, like a memory that isn't ready to leave. We all carry those echoes, don't we? Karmic threads that haven't yet woven their story to the end. It might be a sibling you never made peace with, a friend who betrayed you and never said sorry, or a love that vanished without explanation, leaving only a drawer full of postcards and an ache that hums beneath certain songs. And we tell ourselves to forget, to move on, to be strong. But Buddhism offers a softer path. It doesn't ask you to forget. It asks you to understand, to sit with the ache, not to drown in it, but to listen, like listening to the last notes of a lullaby you didn't know you needed. Because those who appear in our minds again and again often come bearing something unfinished. A lesson, a request, a reflection. I once asked a monk why he thought I kept dreaming of my father. We were sitting under a Bodhi tree, just as the sun was beginning to drop behind the hill. The monk didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a fallen leaf and turned it in his fingers. Sometimes, he said, karma comes to us not as consequence, but as invitation. Invitation to what? I asked. To open the door we closed too quickly. That night, I didn't dream of my father, but I did sit with a photograph I hadn't looked at in years. And I whispered something I had never said out loud. I forgive you for not knowing how to love me. And perhaps more importantly, I forgive myself for needing you to. In Buddhist psychology, this kind of practice isn't about blaming or excusing. It's about integration, about allowing all parts of an experience to be seen clearly without grasping or pushing away. It's like when a river meets a stone. It doesn't stop. It doesn't break. It simply flows around it with awareness, with patience, with grace. That's the practice of karma, letting the stream of your life meet each unfinished place with compassion, so the current can keep moving. There's a story from the Zen tradition about a man who carried a heavy sack of stones across a desert. When asked why he carried them, he said they were reminders of everyone who had ever wronged him. And what will you do with them when you arrive? A traveler asked. I don't know, the man said. I just know I don't want to forget. But by the time he reached the other side, his back was broken, his heart bitter. This story doesn't end with a lesson shouted. It ends with the image of the sack, resting silently by the side of the path, waiting for us to decide when to set ours down, too. I don't think I'll ever forget my father, and maybe I'm not meant to, but I no longer carry the same sack. Now, when he visits me in dreams, I sit with him. Sometimes we speak. Sometimes we just sit, sharing tea in silence. And when I wake, it feels less like longing and more like peace. If there's someone in your life who keeps returning in thought, in dream, in unexpected memories, don't push them away just yet. Ask instead, what is unfinished between us? What part of me still wants to be heard? What lesson remains unlived? Sit with the question, not to get a quick answer, but to allow the truth to rise gently, like morning fog lifting over the garden of your heart. And when it comes, welcome it like a long-lost friend. Because karma doesn't seek to hurt you. It seeks to complete you, to teach you how to stand with all the versions of yourself you've been and still choose softness, to teach you how to hear a voice from the past and reply with love, not because it was easy, but because your heart was ready to sing again. Chapter 3, the mirror we try not to look into, how others reflect the self we hide from. I used to get annoyed by this one woman at the meditation group I attended. She was always a little too loud, a little too polished. She'd float into the room like a swan wearing perfume, talking just a bit too confidently, always quoting something wise right after the teacher had finished speaking. And then she'd smile as if her presence was a blessing. It irritated me more than I wanted to admit. I remember coming home after one particular gathering, sighing loudly as I kicked off my sandals. I told myself she was just performative, that she wasn't authentic, that I couldn't trust people like her. But as I said the words out loud to my partner, he simply looked at me and asked, "Are you sure it's her you're mad at?" I didn't answer. I just went quiet. But something inside me started to feel exposed, like someone had turned on the lights too suddenly in a room I hadn't cleaned. That night, I sat with my tea in silence. There was no wind, but the bamboo wind chime outside still swayed gently, making soft wooden clinks like a patient reminder to listen. And in that stillness, something very old began to rise in me. A memory not of her, but of me. Me at 19, standing in front of a lecture hall, giving a presentation with full confidence, only to be laughed at later by a group of girls who called me too much. I had learned somewhere along the way that being loud, being bright, being seen was dangerous. And I had stuffed that part of me down, convinced it wasn't welcome in the world. And now here she was, a mirror, not my enemy, my reflection. It hit me like a quiet wave. I wasn't irritated because she was fake. I was irritated because I had disowned the part of me that used to be like her, that longed to shine unapologetically. And instead of facing that ache, I projected my discomfort onto her. We all do this, and that's okay. But what's not okay, what keeps us stuck, is when we don't realize we're doing it. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny, suppress, reject. Buddhism, in its own way, agrees. The outer world, in Zen teaching, reflects the inner world. The people who stir us, trigger us, challenge us, are rarely just out there. They are invitations to turn inward. The Buddha once said, "We are shaped by our thoughts. We become what we think." But I believe it's equally true that we are revealed by what we react to. I want to tell you a story, not from scripture, but from a friend of mine named Daniel. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, a bit shy. He worked as a school counselor and was deeply admired, except for this one colleague. A bold, brash gym teacher who always stole attention in meetings, made bold declarations, and never second-guessed himself. Daniel couldn't stand him. Every time the teacher spoke, Daniel would tighten. He'd come home exhausted after meetings, complaining about the man's arrogance, his toxic masculinity, his inflated ego. He was everything Daniel believed he wasn't. One day, during a long walk through the forest together, I gently asked Daniel, "Do you think it's possible he represents a part of you you've learned to silence?" He stopped walking. He didn't speak for a long time. We just stood there, the two of us, watching a heron glide quietly over a glassy pond. Then he said, "When I was a kid, my dad told me not to be so loud, that no one likes a show-off. So I learned to stay small, and I guess I resent people who don't." We didn't say much after that, but something shifted in him. Not dramatically, not all at once. But the next time we spoke, he told me he had started saying what he really thought in meetings. He didn't try to imitate the gym teacher, but he no longer feared being noticed. That's what happens when we reclaim the shadow, not by fighting it, but by welcoming it back home. In Zen practice, there is a gentle invitation to sit with what arises. That includes not just our pain or our memories, but our reactions to others. The next time someone stirs you, whether through jealousy, irritation, or judgment, I invite you to ask softly, without shame, what part of me do they mirror that I've buried? It's not always obvious. Sometimes the mirror is warped. Sometimes the reflection is covered in fog. But if we sit long enough, the image begins to appear. And once it does, we stop seeing that person as the problem. We start seeing them as the path. There's a quiet kind of freedom in that. Not the kind that comes from cutting people out or changing them, but the kind that comes from returning to yourself whole and unashamed. Imagine a garden. Wild, messy, and full of life. Some flowers bloom easily in the sun. Others hide beneath the soil, waiting for a sign that it's safe to come out. The shadow is like that. It's not evil. It's not dangerous. It's simply the part of you that's been waiting to be seen without fear. That woman from the meditation group, I eventually spoke to her. We shared tea after one session, and I told her, awkwardly but honestly, that I had found her presence challenging at first, and that it had helped me see something in myself I had buried. She didn't laugh. She didn't judge. She just smiled, eyes soft, and said, "Me too. I've spent most of my life wondering if I'm too much." That moment, that's what healing looks like. Two mirrors gently turning toward one another. I still get triggered. Of course I do. I'm human. But now, when it happens, I try not to run. I try to breathe, to look deeper, to see if the anger, the envy, the discomfort is really just a part of me knocking on the door, asking to be loved. And when I'm brave enough to open that door, even just a little, I often find the ache isn't as sharp as I thought. Sometimes it's just a younger version of me, asking to come home. So tonight, if someone comes to mind who has unsettled you, someone whose presence seems to linger like a thorn, try this gentle question. What is it about them that bothers me most? And listen, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Maybe what you'll hear is the sound of your own voice, buried beneath the noise of expectations and shame, quietly asking to be heard again. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that what once felt like a wound was really an unopened door. Let's open it together. Chapter 4, The Life That Could Have Been. When we can't let go of the ending we imagined. I used to think closure came with a conversation. You know, that final cup of tea, the long walk, the kind, slightly teary exchange where both people finally say the things they never said. Maybe it ends in a hug, or a smile, or at the very least, mutual understanding. Clean, complete. But life rarely gives us that. Instead, we're left with echoes, unsent messages, questions that swirl around the room like incense smoke long after the fire has gone out. He left without saying goodbye, and I stayed, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I stayed in the unfinished pages. I stayed in the parallel lives we never lived. And every night, like clockwork, my mind would press replay. I'd walk through the scenes again, say something different, ask the right question. Maybe this time he wouldn't leave. Maybe this time he'd understand me. Maybe this time the ending would change. But it never did, because it wasn't him I was trying to hold on to. It was the outcome I had imagined, the future we never got to live. And that kind of clinging, it's the most invisible kind of suffering. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It sneaks in like a daydream while you're washing dishes or folding laundry. It curls up beside you in the quiet moments and reminds you, not of what was, but of what could have been. And that, my friend, is the deepest ache. There's a Zen phrase I've always loved, Shoshin. It means beginner's mind. It's the practice of meeting this moment, the one right in front of you, with openness, without assumptions, without the tight grip of expectation. But when we're attached to outcomes, we do the opposite. We carry old scripts into new scenes. We hold on to how things should have gone like a map that leads us back to a place that no longer exists. A man I once knew, let's call him Sam, used to tell me about the woman he almost married. 10 years had passed. He had moved across the country, changed careers, dated other people, and still her name sat just under the surface of everything. He told me that every time he was alone, he'd catch himself playing out the life they didn't live. He knew rationally that it was over, that it had ended for good reasons. But in his heart, he was still chasing the version of the story where they made it. "Do you think I'm grieving her?" he asked me once. I thought for a moment, then said gently, "I think you're grieving the life you imagined." There was a long silence, the kind of silence that feels like truth has just entered the room. He nodded, and I could see something soften in him. Because when we name it, when we see that we are mourning not the person, but the picture, we begin to reclaim our peace. In Buddhist teachings, suffering often arises not from what is, but from our resistance to what is. We don't suffer because someone left. We suffer because we wanted them to stay. We suffer because our hearts wrote a future our lives didn't agree to. That's the trap of the what if. What if I had said it differently? What if I had fought harder? What if we met now, not then? What if? It's like grasping at fog. No matter how tightly you close your hand, you cannot hold it. You only end up with the ache of emptiness. Zen invites us instead to let go of the storyline, to sit in the unknowing, to allow the mystery of what happened to simply be.
No fixing.
No rewriting, just presence. Just the breath in your body, the weight of your feet on the floor, the truth of this moment, unadorned. One morning, while staying at a small retreat center nestled in the hills, I watched a lotus bloom just as the sun rose. It opened so slowly, I almost missed it, but what struck me wasn't the flower. It was the way the petals let go. Not all at once, not dramatically, just gently, one soft layer at a time. And I thought maybe that's how we heal, not by forcing ourselves to move on, but by letting go, layer by layer, breath by breath, until what remains is just stillness. There's a beauty in mourning what never happened. It means your heart was capable of dreaming, of hoping, of loving. But there's also beauty in coming back to the life that is, to the tea growing cold in your hands, to the laughter of your friend on the phone, to the stranger who smiled at you in the grocery store when you felt invisible. This life, your real life, is not the consolation prize. It's the only one you truly have. And it is still full of mystery, still full of moments waiting to bloom. Sometimes I still catch myself drifting, especially late at night when the world is quiet and my mind has space to wander. I'll imagine the version of me that ended up with him, the house we never lived in, the child we never had, the arguments we never got to work through, the ordinary things we never grew old doing. But now, when those thoughts come, I don't chase them. I don't try to rewrite them. I just smile gently, the way you might smile at a paper boat floating down a stream. You don't need to rescue it. You don't need to follow it. You just watch it pass. Because this moment, this version of life, is enough. And even if it's not the one you pictured, it's the one that's real. The one where healing is possible, where peace is possible, where you can love not just what was or what might have been, but what is. So tonight, if you find yourself replaying the old movie, imagining different endings, I invite you to pause. Place your hand on your heart, take a breath, and whisper to yourself, I release the life that never was, and return to the one that still waits for me. Because peace doesn't come from the story you wanted. It comes from loving the one you're in. And that love, that quiet, present, faithful love, is always here, waiting, like the morning sun behind the clouds, ready to rise again. Chapter 5, The Sky Behind the Clouds. Finding yourself beyond the thought. There was a time I believed every thought that entered my mind. If the voice in my head said, he doesn't care about you anymore, I'd feel a pit in my stomach. If it whispered, you'll never be whole without them, I believed that too. The mind would serve up images like a film projector, old memories, imagined futures, worst-case scenarios, and I would sit there motionless, letting the reel play. I didn't realize I had a choice, that I could stop being the audience to every passing storm. It took me years, and more than a few nights staring at the ceiling with an ache I couldn't name, to understand that not every thought was the truth. Sometimes a thought is just a cloud, not a prophecy, not a command, not a verdict, just vapor, passing, disappearing if you let it. There's something deeply comforting about that idea, isn't there? It means that even the heaviest thoughts, the ones soaked in fear or sadness, don't have to define you. They don't have to be your identity. They don't have to stay. I remember once, during a silent meditation retreat in a small mountain temple, the teacher invited us to sit and watch our thoughts like clouds in the vast blue sky. It sounded simple enough, but of course it wasn't. At first, all I could hear was noise. Plans, regrets, fragments of conversations. The voice of someone I hadn't seen in years suddenly whispering in my mind. I remember thinking, how can I watch the sky if I'm stuck inside the storm? But something began to shift when I stopped trying to clear my thoughts. and instead, just watched them float, like leaves on a stream. One thought about my old relationship floated by, then another about whether I was wasting my life, then one about what I'd eat for lunch. Some made me smile, some made my eyes sting, but none of them stayed. And slowly I saw it, the gap between me and the thoughts, the space. It wasn't much at first, just a flicker, a half-second of recognition. Oh, that's just a thought. I don't have to follow it. But that tiny space was everything, because it was in that space that peace could grow. You see, the Buddha didn't ask us to stop thinking. He never said the mind should be empty all the time. What he taught was much gentler. He said, thoughts arise, stay, and pass away. Don't cling. Don't cling. And that's where the suffering lies, doesn't it? In the clinging. We get a thought, I'm not enough, or they've forgotten me, or what if I never find love again? And instead of letting it float by like a leaf on the water, we grab it. We cradle it. We rehearse it until it becomes a belief, a story, a whole identity. We stop seeing the sky. We only see the clouds. But the sky, the vast, open awareness behind it all, is always there. It's the part of you that notices the thoughts, that can name them without becoming them. And the more you practice returning to that sky, the less the clouds scare you. There's an old Zen story I love about a young monk who ran to his teacher in a panic. Master, my mind is full of terrible thoughts, he said. The teacher replied, leave the door open. Let them come. Let them go. Just don't serve them tea. That story makes me laugh gently every time I remember it. Because how often do we serve tea to our worst thoughts? We invite them in. We decorate the table. We ask them to stay a while. And then we wonder why our hearts feel so heavy. But what if we didn't have to be such generous hosts to our suffering? What if we could learn to simply notice the thought, nod to it with kindness, and let it pass? There's a practice in mindfulness meditation called noting. When a thought arises, instead of diving into its content, you simply label it. Thinking, or more specifically, planning, remembering, worrying, judging, just a label. No judgment. No analysis. And with that tiny shift in attention, something loosens. Because now you're not in the thought. You're observing it. You've stepped back into your true nature. Not the ever-changing weather, but the wide sky holding it all. I remember once during a particularly heavy time, post-breakup, still raw and lost, I walked through a garden just before dusk. The wind was soft. The lanterns were flickering. The temple bell had just rung for evening prayer. I sat by a small stone bench under a fig tree, and a thought came, you're always going to feel like this. For a moment, I believed it. Then I remembered the leaf. I imagined that thought like a single yellow leaf, falling from a high branch into the stream beside me. And I let it float, just like that. And in that quiet moment, something tender rose within me. Not a grand realization, just a gentle knowing. This too will pass, because thoughts always do. They only stay when we grab them and call them me. But you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that sees them. You are the stillness behind the storm. You are the sky behind the clouds. So next time a painful thought arises, whether it's about someone you can't forget, or a future you're afraid won't come, try this. Pause. Take a breath. Label it gently. This is sadness. Or this is fear. Or simply, this is remembering. Then let it float. You don't need to push it away. You just don't need to serve it tea. Let your breath guide you back to the now, to the scent of jasmine in the breeze, to the warm tea in your hand, to the hush of twilight settling gently over your life. Because this moment, this breath, this stillness, this presence is your home. And every thought is just a traveler passing through. Chapter 6. When the leaves let go. Embracing the truth that all things change. I used to think some feelings would last forever. You know, the kind that lives in your bones. The grief that wraps around your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The kind of ache that arrives quietly, like mist curling in at dawn, and lingers long after everyone else has gone home. There was a time when I thought I would always feel that way about her, that the sound of her name would always send a ripple through my heart, that the silence she left behind would echo louder than anything else in my life. But now it's different. Not because the love disappeared, not because I forced it out, but because something softer took its place. Time maybe, or tenderness, or simply the quiet truth that everything changes. Even this. I remember the first time I heard the phrase, "This too will change." I was sitting in a dusty zendo at the edge of a forest in late autumn. Outside, the maple trees were letting go of their leaves with the kind of elegance only nature knows how to carry. A grieving student had asked the master how to stop the pain of loss. The master didn't lecture. He didn't explain. He just picked up a leaf from the ground, turned it slowly in his hand, and said softly, "This too will change." Not as comfort, not as platitude, but as truth. That phrase stayed with me for years, like a soft mantra whispering behind everything I thought was permanent. The joy, the sorrow, the relationships I thought would define me, all of it shifting, all of it passing. It's funny how we think certain people are forever, that the love we feel today will remain exactly as it is, untouched by time, that the pain of a goodbye will never loosen, that we will always need them the way we do now. But just like the golden leaves that drift gently to the earth, without clinging, without resistance, everything in this life eventually lets go. Even us. Even the versions of ourselves we once clung to so tightly. I once knew someone who used to call their ex every year on the same day. Not to ask for anything, not even to talk. They would just call, let it ring once, then hang up. Like a ritual, a way to hold on to something they weren't ready to release. But one year they forgot, and they didn't even realize it until weeks later. And that's how change happens sometimes. Not in a dramatic wave of healing, but in a quiet moment where we realize the storm has passed. And we didn't even notice. Buddhist teachings invite us to hold everything lightly. Our thoughts, our feelings, even our identities. Because the moment we grasp, we suffer. But when we soften our grip, when we allow things to flow the way rivers flow, the way seasons turn, we find that peace is not about control. It's about surrender. There's an image that often comes to me in meditation. A single brown leaf, still holding onto the branch as the wind tugs gently. It wants to stay, not because it fears falling, but because it's all it has ever known. But eventually, with one last breeze, it lets go. And instead of crashing, it floats, graceful, light, unafraid. And in that falling, it becomes part of something larger. The ground beneath our feet, the compost that feeds spring's bloom. In Zen, impermanence isn't seen as a loss, but as the natural rhythm of life. The unfolding, the becoming. Nothing is wasted. Not the love you once gave to someone who didn't stay. Not the tears you cried alone in the dark. Not even the longing that once pulled at your chest like an anchor. All of it belongs. All of it is part of the great letting go. I once kept a voicemail from someone I loved for years. I'd listen to it when I missed them. It was just a short message. Ordinary, really. Hey, just checking in. Hope you're okay. But the tone, the warmth in their voice was a thread I didn't want to lose. One day, while changing phones, it got erased. Gone in an instant. And I cried. Not because of the message itself, but because of what it represented. But then something beautiful happened. I realized I didn't need the voicemail anymore. Because what mattered had already become part of me. Their presence. The love we shared. The lessons I learned through knowing them. None of that could be erased. Because it had already transformed me, like a cup of tea that disappears, but leaves warmth in your hands. That's what impermanence gives us, not just endings, but integration. The chance to carry what matters without needing to hold on. So if today you're aching from a loss, or clutching an old memory that feels too heavy to carry but too precious to release, I invite you to pause. Step outside if you can. Look up at the trees. Watch how the leaves fall. They don't resist. They don't plead. They just let go and dance their way to the earth. And beneath them, already, the soil begins to soften for spring. You see, the very act of letting go is what allows the new to grow. Your grief has changed you. Your love has shaped you. But you don't have to keep reliving it to keep honoring it. Let it become part of you, not as pain, but as depth. Let the person who once consumed your thoughts become a soft, distant hum in the background of your being. Not forgotten, just transformed. And trust, with your whole heart, that no storm lasts forever. Not even this one. And one day, sooner than you think, you'll wake up and feel the breeze again. Not as a reminder of who left, but as a whisper of everything that is still arriving. You'll feel the sun. You'll smile for no reason. You'll find yourself laughing at something small, like the way a bird hops sideways along the railing, or the sound of rain tapping gently on your window. And in that moment, you'll realize something has shifted. You've changed, because everything changes. Even the ache, even the story, even the you who once thought this feeling would never end. Let that version rest now. Let them go like a leaf in the wind, and watch what grows in the space they leave behind. Because peace is not the absence of change. Peace is learning to love the change, to trust it, to become it, like the lotus that only blooms because the mud was once so deep, like the sky that opens only after the rain, like your own heart learning, finally, gently, faithfully, how to hold itself. Chapter 7: The ones who arrive to break you open. When a soul enters just to change you, there are people who don't stay. They arrive like rain in the middle of a drought. Unexpected, overwhelming, beautiful, and then they vanish. Not because they were never meant to be there, but because their role was never to stay. I didn't understand that at first. I used to believe that if someone made your soul stir, if your entire being shifted just by standing next to them, it must mean something lasting, something destined. But sometimes, what is destined isn't forever. Sometimes it's just enough. Enough to awaken something that had been sleeping in you. Enough to crack open the shell around your heart so the light could finally get in. I learned this slowly, not through teachings or books, but through ache. Through remembering someone I could not forget, long after they had gone. Through feeling their presence in my dreams, in songs, in moments so ordinary they made my eyes sting. And it wasn't because they were perfect. In fact, they hurt me, not cruelly, not even intentionally, but in that soft, brutal way that life sometimes uses to peel us open. For a long time, I kept asking, why can't I forget them? Why does my heart still reach toward a story that has no more pages? Why are they still in my thoughts, years after the door closed? And then, one evening, I heard something in a Dharma talk that shifted everything. Some people do not come to love you. They come to awaken you. The words hit like a bell struck at midnight. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't obsession. It wasn't failure. It was a soul assignment. You see, in Buddhist wisdom, and especially in the Zen and Tibetan traditions, there is this quiet understanding that not all suffering is meant to be eliminated immediately. Some of it, paradoxically, is sacred, transformational, chosen by the soul before we even arrived in this body. There is an old parable I once heard from a teacher during a retreat in Kyoto. A young monk had been betrayed by his own brother. They had entered the monastery together, grown under the same roof, practiced the same sutras. But the brother, caught in jealousy, accused him of stealing sacred texts and had him banished from the temple. For years, the monk wandered, angry, lost, alone, until one day, while walking beside a quiet stream near a forest temple, he looked down at his reflection and didn't recognize himself. Not because he had become worse, but because he had become deeper, softer, freer. And in that moment, he realized it was through the betrayal that he had truly begun his path. It had cut the final thread tying him to praise, to image, to approval. His enlightenment hadn't been found in the safety of brotherhood. It had begun with the wound. The teacher who told that story paused and said quietly, "Sometimes, the one who hurts you most is the one your soul loves most, because only they were willing to play that part." I think about that a lot, about how life isn't always fair, but it's often wise. How the ones who challenge us, reject us, abandon us, may be playing the role we ask them to, not with malice, but with purpose, to teach us how to forgive, how to let go, how to rise when no one is clapping, how to love without needing to possess, how to become someone we would not have become had they stayed. One afternoon, I was sitting in the temple garden after a particularly long sit. The light was changing, the kind of golden light that makes everything feel holy, and the wind carried the scent of old jasmine petals. I was thinking of someone I hadn't thought of in a while, someone who had changed me and left, and for the first time, instead of sorrow, I felt gratitude. Not the kind you perform, the kind that comes from the bone, because in their absence I had learned how to be present. In their silence I had learned to hear myself. In their leaving I had met the part of me that could stay. So perhaps the question is no longer, why can't I forget them? Perhaps it's this, what have they been trying to teach me all along? And even more tenderly, who have I become because of them? There's a beautiful teaching in Buddhism that says our enemies may be our greatest spiritual allies. That those who stir our deepest pain may also carry our deepest lessons. Because growth doesn't always come with soft music and gentle hands. Sometimes it arrives in the form of heartbreak, of abandonment, of that one sentence they said that you still hear in the quiet hours. And sometimes it arrives years later in the form of realization. Like a lotus blooming in muddy water. Quiet, steady, miraculous. So if someone still lingers in your mind, long after you thought you'd healed, maybe don't rush to push them away. Maybe sit beside their memory like you would sit beside a fire. Feel the warmth. Let the smoke sting your eyes if it must. And then listen, not with your ears, with your soul. Because what if, just what if, this person wasn't here to ruin your life? What if they were here to shift it, to reroute it, to place you on a path your small self never would have chosen, but your deeper self knew was right? And what if their job is done now? What if they're still in your thoughts not because they are meant to return, but because the lesson is finally ready to be understood? You don't have to chase them. You don't have to forget them. You only have to ask the right question in the right moment of stillness. And then watch. Watch how the answer doesn't come like thunder, but like mist at dawn. Soft, slow, sacred. You'll know it when it arrives, because you'll feel something unlock. Not out there, in here. And in that moment, you might whisper something you never thought you'd say. Thank you for playing your part. And then gently, finally, let them go. Not with bitterness, not with longing, but with grace, as if placing a feather into the wind and watching it drift home. Chapter 8, The Way Water Softens Stone. 5 gentle practices for letting go without forcing it. I used to believe that letting go had to be dramatic, like tearing something out by the roots, like storming into your past with a torch and burning it clean. I imagined it would feel like triumph, strong, loud, maybe even a little cinematic. But it didn't feel like that at all. Letting go, when it finally happened, came like a sigh, quiet, barely noticeable, like mist lifting from the surface of a pond at dawn. I didn't even realize it had happened at first. I just noticed one day that the thought of them didn't sting the same way anymore. And that was when I understood. Letting go doesn't always mean doing something. Sometimes it means doing a little less. It means not clinging, not chasing, not forcing yourself to forget or forgive on schedule. It means letting your heart soften in its own time. In Buddhism, the practice of release, of truly freeing the mind from its entanglements, is never an act of violence. It's not about pushing memories out. It's not about deleting someone from your head like a file from your desktop. It's more like watching a river. You sit on the bank. You watch your thoughts pass, like leaves or petals floating by. You don't dive in. You don't dam the stream. You don't try to catch and hold every leaf. You just breathe, watch, let it flow. And slowly, very slowly, the water starts to calm. Here's what I've learned, not just from teachings, but from living through them, crying through them, and returning to them again and again when I didn't know what else to do. Letting go begins with presence, and presence begins with practice. Gentle, everyday practice, not dramatic gestures, but small sacred steps you take with your bare feet on the ground of your own heart. So today, I want to share with you 5 simple practices that have helped me loosen my grip, not on the love, but on the suffering, on the need to control the story, on the idea that peace only comes when the past is perfectly resolved. These are not prescriptions. These are invitations. Let's walk through them together, like petals falling on the surface of the stream. The first, for me, was learning to just observe. I remember one afternoon, sitting alone on the temple porch, watching clouds drift across a pale blue sky. My heart was heavy that day. Thoughts of someone I once loved kept returning, not with sharp pain anymore, but with a kind of wistful ache. I had spent so many years either fighting those thoughts, telling myself I shouldn't think about them, or feeding them, turning them over and over until they became sharp again. But that day I just watched. I let the thought arise. I let it stay, and then it passed. It was just a thought, not a truth, not a demand, just passing weather in the sky of my mind. That's what mindful observation is. Letting a thought be a cloud, not something to solve, not something to shame yourself for, just a visitor, pausing for tea and then leaving on its own. As the old teaching says, what you resist persists. What you observe transforms. The second practice came in the form of a question I wasn't ready to answer, until I was. What part of me is still holding on? Not what part of me still misses them. That was too easy. But what part of me, my identity, my fear, my longing, was wrapped around their memory like vines around a stone? And more importantly, could I meet that part of myself with kindness? Not try to cut it away, but sit beside it like a child who's afraid, who needs listening, not fixing. This is what I call compassionate inquiry. It's not interrogating yourself. It's inviting yourself to speak. It's looking at your ache and saying, I see you. You're welcome here, but you don't have to drive anymore. When I finally asked, gently, what am I really holding on to? I found my answer wasn't about them at all. It was about me, about the way I needed to be chosen, about the part of me that equated being loved with being safe, about the loneliness I hadn't named. And with that awareness, something loosened, not gone, just softer. The third practice isn't glamorous. It doesn't make a great story, but it might be the most important. Acceptance, not as defeat, but as freedom. I used to think acceptance meant giving up, that if I accepted the loss, the silence, the unanswered questions, it meant I didn't care anymore. But that's not what acceptance is. Acceptance is not giving up. It's giving space. It's letting go of the grip, not the memory. It's saying, this happened, and I may never fully understand it, but I will stop trying to wrestle it into something it's not. There's a small practice I use now. When I notice myself gripping, whether it's a memory, a hope, or a fantasy, I look at my hands. Are they clenched? If they are, I open them, just slightly. I picture myself holding that memory gently, like a small bird in my palms, letting it breathe, not trying to cage it, because that's what letting go feels like. Not a slam of a door, but the quiet opening of your hands. The fourth practice came to me like a whisper during a walk. Use the memory as a mindfulness bell. You know those little bells they ring in temples to call you back to presence? What if every time you thought of that person, it wasn't a trap, but a doorway? What if that thought could become a cue not to spiral, but to return? To your breath, to your body, to now. This is what I call intentional redirection. Not denial, not distraction, but using the old thought as a path back to the present. Each time they cross your mind, let it be a moment to breathe, to feel your feet on the earth, to smile gently and say, ah, this is now. And finally, the fifth practice, the one that changed me more than all the rest, loving kindness, not just as a meditation, but as a way of being. There is a chant I learned years ago during a retreat, and I still return to it. May I be free from suffering. May I feel safe and held. May I be at peace. And then, with shaky hands sometimes, I extend it to them. May you be free from suffering. May you feel safe and held. May you be at peace. It doesn't mean I forget. It doesn't mean I pretend they didn't hurt me. It just means I stop drinking the poison of resentment. It means I remember that underneath it all, we are both just human, both trying, both learning. And the funny thing is, when you stop trying to let go in the traditional sense, something miraculous happens. You don't forget them, you forgive them, you thank them silently for the lesson, even if it came wrapped in pain. And slowly they become less like a sharp edge and more like a stone in a river. That last image, the one I always return to, is this: the mind is a river, and the people we cannot forget are like stones tossed in. At first, the water splashes, waves crash, everything is disturbed. But if we let the river keep flowing, if we don't build dams or try to stop the current, one of two things will happen. Either the stone settles peacefully into the riverbed, or it is gently carried away. Either way, the river calms, not because we forced it to, but because we trusted the flow. That, to me, is the truest kind of peace. The kind that comes when we no longer need the past to be different, when we no longer grip the story so tightly that it hurts, when we can love and still let go. So if you're here now, sitting quietly with me in this moment of reflection, I invite you to take just one of these practices into your day. Just one. Maybe it's opening your hands when you notice them clenched. Maybe it's whispering, "May you be at peace," when their name appears in your mind. Maybe it's just watching a thought float by like a petal on a stream. Whatever it is, let it be enough. Let it be gentle. Let it be kind. Because letting go isn't about forgetting. It's about flowing forward. And you, dear one, are the river. You were never meant to stay stuck in the past. You were always meant to move with grace. Some people arrive to stay. Others arrive to stir. But all who visit the mind come bearing a teaching. And when we stop clinging, when we stop making them responsible for our joy or our ache, we begin to hear that teaching, softly, clearly, like a bell at dawn. Maybe the memory was never the enemy. Maybe it was a doorway to the part of you that still needs kindness, to the self you thought only they could love, to the peace that was waiting on the other side of surrender. Like the river that carries the stone without struggle, you are allowed to keep flowing, not because you've moved on, but because you've returned home, to now, to this breath, to yourself. So I invite you to pause here, just for a moment, and ask gently, what part of you is finally ready to stop holding on? Let that answer rise like mist. Let it soften the edges of your story. Let it show you the kind of love that never needs possession to be real. And if you're willing, share with me in the comments. Sparkles, who have you been learning to release? And what have they taught you? And if your heart longs for more of this soft, sacred space, subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings. Not just for a video, but for a path. One will continue walking together. Until then, may every echo become a blessing. May every memory become light. And may your mind finally become a place of rest.